Hello, and welcome to another 31 Days of Horror movie review with me, Anders Holmes, host of the Holmes Movies podcast. With my movie marathon, I wanted to go back away from modern horror films just for a little bit to talk a little bit about a horror classic, which is probably one of the most influential films of all time, and that is George A. Romero's directorial debut, The Night of the Living Dead, released in 1968. With the passing of George A. Romero, I really wanted to use this marathon to go back and look at some of his films that have made a great impression on me. Not all of his movies, but the ones that I feel like the most important to talk about that would really sum up his career. And Night of the Living Dead is one of those movies. It is a fantastic film, and it's so much more than just a group of people holding out in a farmhouse during a zombie apocalypse. Like, there's so much under the surface, and it just, there's so much there to talk about. And, it's used as a way of looking at the time of the 60s when they were making the film. There's a lot of these themes on race and, about the Vietnam War and all these things that were going on at this time. And it's such a really interesting film. And, it just, George A. Romero, he was such a unique and different kind of horror director. Like, he used his monsters to symbolize humanity and the people of society at the times when he was making his films and trying to sort of, make horror satires, which I thought was such a really interesting thing to do, and makes him just really just puts him, over many horror directors of his generation. George A. Romero was making commercials in Pittsburgh with a group of friends. One of them, I think, was John Russo, who co-wrote the screenplay of Night of the Living Dead. And they were growing really tired of doing these commercials for people, and they decided to, piece together what money they had and finance their first movie. And, the movie originated as like an alien movie. It was called Monster Flick, and then they changed the script around, and then they called it Night of the Living Dead. And they had absolutely no idea that these group of, ambitious amateur filmmakers, stage actors, all these people who were interested in making the film and had, had some sort of careers in the media or film industry, they had absolutely no idea what kind of film they were making, and had no idea that it would be such an iconic film in the horror genre, and how much it just excelled and became so much more than the film that they were making. Like, in the same way with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like Tobe Hooper and his crew and cast had absolutely no idea what this film would be talked about for years to come. And it's amazing. Like, you have no idea what your movie will have an effect on generations of cinema goers. It's quite fantastic when you think about it. Night of the Living Dead is not only one of the best horror films ever made, but it's also the most influential horror film ever made. It changed the way that horror films were made, and it really changed the horror genre, and it put it on a completely different course than what we've seen already. Before then, it was Universal monster movies and films like House on Haunted Hill, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Creature Features, and many other nuclear-related horror films. With the success of Night of the Living Dead, a lot of aspiring film directors followed suit. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, directed by Tobe Hooper. The Last House on the Left, directed by Wes Craven. Halloween, directed by John Carpenter. All these films really just set in motion and really changed the way filmmakers look at horror film, and really brought it into the mainstream, and really changed the way that they were made and what they were about and things like that. Like, really put it on a completely different wavelength. These three directors, they changed the horror from being about monsters and ghouls and rubber masks, and moving away from gothic monsters and fairy tales and into the modern world. Night of the Living Dead wasn't the first movie to tackle the zombie subgenre. There were films before that, like I Walked with a Zombie and White Zombie. Those films were, using Caribbean and Haitian folklore as an inspiration. But, George A. Romero took the zombie genre and did it in his own real unique way. And he became the king of zombie movies. Like, he didn't create the genre. He just, took it and made it his own. And, because of him, the zombie movies that have come out afterwards have followed his style. And, well, not really so much his style, but they have followed what he did with them. And, he really set the sort of ground rules for zombie films to come after the release of Night of the Living Dead. What George A. Romero did with his monsters and zombies and the horror films that he made was he was using them as a way of mirroring our lives and society. Each of the Living Dead films he did all had some political and social commentary. Night of the Living Dead shows that you don't have to be part of the studio system to make a movie, and that's one of the things I really liked about George A. Romero is that he really... he said he didn't want to be part of that shit, and he wanted to really stay away from Hollywood and do the films that he wanted to do. And, if he was part of the studio system, his films would be so different from how he envisioned, them before he started filming them. George A. Romero was always one of those directors that really stayed true to what he was. He was a horror director. He really, wasn't anything else than that. He did what he loved to do, and that was horror films. The films that he made were of their time, but, looking at the way that the world is now, these movies are incredibly relevant as they were when they were first released. The second half of the 60s was an incredibly tough time in America and also around the world. You had the Vietnam War. It was unpopular. It was still going on. You had the Civil Rights Movement. You had, the Black Panther movement rising up. Like, you had all these things. Like, there's a line in Night of the Living Dead where someone says, "Don't you know what's going on out there?" The optimism of the 1950s was shattered since JFK's assassination. It's this kind of pessimism that shows a society on the verge of collapse. The monsters being represented as people rebelling against the patriarch. The world was going bad, and it was invading television sets of people's homes. Like, everything that was going on with the Civil Rights Movement and everything that was going on in Vietnam and how that war was just falling apart was just, people were starting to become really aware of everything, of all the sort of change and bad things that were going on. Boarding up the house from the zombies represents people not wanting to hear and be oblivious to what was going on in the world. Night of the Living Dead is so far away from mainstream, and it found its audience with people who really shared Romero's ideals. This movie is very different aesthetically. It's shot in black and white. It's mostly handheld. It's like you're watching a documentary, and very rare for films that were made at this time, it had very unsettling scenes of bloody violence. Like, this was probably one of the most violent films of the time, and I think it was really a film that most people were shocked to see, and, it found its home with midnight screenings, but it was quite a tough film for that period because, before then they shied away from violence. Like, this film is really in your face. Like, when these two kids are blown up in their truck accidentally and then these zombies, pick at their corpses and start eating them. Like, that must have really freaked the crap out of a 1960s audience who probably weren't even used to that sort of, carnage at that time. Like, it just mirrored quite a lot of different things. The film was one of the first movies to have a black actor as the main character, and the closest thing that the film has to a hero, like the one who takes charge in the movie. The film starts with Barbara and Johnny going to the cemetery to put a wreath on their mother's grave, but once Barbara gets to the farmhouse, the movie becomes more about Ben than her, as she spends most of the time being catatonic on the sofa and not really doing much until the end of the film. But then by that point, she gets taken away and devoured. Like, the character of Ben was, a bit more of a working class and not as educated. Dwayne Jones was a stage actor and well-educated, and he did not like how this character was being represented in the film and wanted, he brought his own spin on the character, and the role was rewritten for him. And George A. Romero, he didn't, when he was writing the script, he didn't envision Ben as a black character. He just really liked Dwayne Jones, and he cast him in the film because he was a really good actor. The main tension in the film is between Harry Cooper, played by Carl Hardman, and Ben. Both argue where they should hide in the house. Harry Cooper wants everyone to go into the cellar, while Ben believes that it's a death trap. Like, if the zombies got in, where the hell are they going to go? Like, it becomes a demonstration of power and intelligence with them, with both trying to get the high ground over the other. And both of them struggle with working together. And, it costs them their lives because they didn't, listen to one another and actually didn't band together to actually come out of this ordeal that they were in. There's a moment in the movie towards the end when the zombies are about to get into the house, and one thing I should say, the word zombies is never used in the movie at all. And Harry gets a hold of the rifle that Ben uses throughout the film, and he nearly, shoots Ben and uses it on him, but then Ben is able to get the gun away from him, and without a moment of hesitation, Ben shoots Harry Cooper, and Harry Cooper just falls down into the cellar and dies and is eaten by his daughter, who was bitten earlier in the film, and then she then kills her mother in a very traumatizing and horrific scene, which probably also freaked the crap out of most people in 1968. In that scene, Ben lets his rage and hate take over, and it overcomes his reason, and in some cases winning his war at home and killing the representation of his suppression. The sad thing about Ben, even though he survives the night, he is killed at the end of the movie by this armed posse who are kind of on a search and destroy mission to, take out all the ghouls and zombies and trying to sort of take control of the situation because, all hell is overflowing. It's basically society is crumbling, and they're the ones who are going to be like, we're going to take charge and, kill these bastards and all this sort of stuff. It's such a sad moment when that happens. Like, Ben goes through all this trouble to survive, and then he's just shot by these people, and then he's taken away with the others and burnt. And you see these in little stills that make up the credits sequence at the end of the movie, and they're very similar to some old black and white photos of people in America, black people in America, being lynched by a white supremacists and a white mob of people who, just took them out and hung them on trees. Like there was a lot of sort of comparisons with that. Night of the Living Dead is such an amazing film, and you can really just see that Romero made a film that had so many layers to it. It's so much more than just what happens at the farmhouse with the zombies trying to get in to devour these survivors during this apocalypse. And it really was a film that definitely had a lot of substance to it, and he really had a very smart, thought-provoking script that is inspirational for any aspiring filmmaker. Like, each Living Dead film has tackled every counterculture and political aspect of America, and had he been in the studio system, I don't think he would have been able to do the films that he wanted to do and be able to portray the messages that he wanted to say. One of his quotes that perfectly sums up Night of the Living Dead, and I guess what mood he was feeling at the time, was, I think we really were pissed off that the 60s didn't work out and that the world didn't change. And I think that's a brilliant way to sum up the themes and symbolism of Night of the Living Dead, which truly is a fantastic film.